Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another video. Today we are going to be discussing and demystifying the Cronusmax, aka the supposed device that Call of Duty YouTubers are using to cheat and get gameplay. And I wanted to do this video as sort of like a follow-up video to the previous one I made on this topic to go just a little bit more in depth on what the Cronusmax is and what it actually does and is capable of doing. Now, the reason being is I feel there is a lot of misinformation about this particular device. So I wanted to take some time to sort of clear the air and basically explain what this device does and essentially how it works. So big disclaimer before we get started is that I do not condone cheating in multiplayer games, and this video is not intended to promote the use of cheating devices or mods. This is purely for educational purposes, and I want to make that very clear. Also, I did want to try to emulate some visual examples of how certain mods can be used to cheat in Call of Duty, but I'm pretty sure that doing so would technically be a violation of Activision Terms of Service because it's technically cheating and exploiting, and I could be wrong, but I really just don't want to take that chance. So if you want some visual examples of everything I'm talking about in this video, literally all you have to do is go to YouTube and search Cronusmax Anti-Recoil or Cronusmax Aim Assist, and you will see tons and tons and tons of videos showing comparisons, tutorials, examples, and whatnot. So feel free to go down that rabbit hole if you want. But the purpose of this video is really just to set the record straight and explain what these devices are capable of and what they are not capable of doing. So, first off, what is the Cronusmax? Well, simply put, it is a USB modding device that connects between your gaming controller or keyboard and mouse and to your gaming console or PC. So here's a visual example of what that looks like. Now, the Cronusmax has a lot of very practical uses, but it sort of gets a bad rap for being known as a cheating device, and we'll talk more about that here in a bit. But some of the more practical uses are, number one, utilizing third-party controllers for crossplay on console. So let's say you want to use a PS4 controller with the Xbox One. The Cronusmax lets you do that pretty much seamlessly. Same with steering wheels, DDR mats, really whatever controller or input method that you want to use, the Cronusmax will let you do that. Now, keyboard and mouse support for console is another use for the Cronusmax, and it does so in a way where the console thinks you're using a controller, but in reality you are using a keyboard and mouse, so it's a bit sneaky. Another big one is before there was actual USB support for communication on the PS4, like a wired controller connection, pros were using the Cronusmax at tournaments to play on a wired connection because PS4s were freaking out about having so many Bluetooth controllers in one room. So that's the story on that. Next is button remapping and macros. So let's say you're playing a fighting game and you want to do a combo move. Well, instead of actually performing that combo move yourself, you can just simply map that combo or button sequence to one button, and it makes it easier. And lastly are the mods and scripts. This is probably the most interesting one, but a couple examples of mods and scripts specifically for Call of Duty are, number one, Anti-Recoil mod, and I would say this is probably the most practical of any mod for Call of Duty games, but it basically allows the Cronusmax to automatically pull down on your right thumbstick when you're firing your weapon to help counter recoil with weapons. There's also variations of this mod that are more useful for snipers, like you hold your breath as soon as you aim, which is sort of like a button macro. And then there's aim assist mod, which I would say isn't really practical for Call of Duty because Call of Duty already has aim assist on console. But basically how it works is it creates artificial ADS slowdown and idle sway control whenever you are aiming down sight. Last but not least is going to be Jitter mod, or rapid fire mod is what it's called. But essentially the way it works is it utilizes a button sequence or button spamming sequence to make semi-auto weapons shoot quicker or have like rapid fire functions. And these exploits usually get patched relatively quickly by developers. If you haven't seen this before, just go to YouTube and search Jitter mod, and you'll get about 10 pages of what this looks like. But it's really popular, and it's probably the most prominent use for the Cronusmax if you're going to be modding, essentially. So a couple points from this are that the Cronusmax isn't just used for cheating and exploiting. There are practical uses for this, especially for people who either have disabilities or have missing fingers or just don't want to use a certain controller on console. So I probably wouldn't go as far to say that if you own one of these devices that you are a cheater. It really just depends on what you're using it for and what the circumstance is, I guess is the best way to explain it. Okay, so now let's talk about what the Cronusmax is not. We know what it does, but what is it not capable of? Well, contrary to what you may have heard or have been told or have seen, but the Cronusmax is not a hacking device. The Cronusmax does not actually change the code or the dynamic of the game that you're playing. So for example, the Cronusmax cannot change the recoil variables of your gun, but it can be programmed to pull down on your right thumbstick when you ADS or fire. Same with aim assist. The Cronusmax cannot enable auto aim or hacks or strengthen aim assist mechanics within the game's code, but it can simulate controller movements to create slowdown effects or idle sway control whenever you ADS or fire your weapon. Okay, so now let's talk about a very popular question, and that is, why are people not getting banned for using Cronusmax? Well, simply put is that games cannot detect Cronus users because your hardware basically sees the Cronusmax as a third-party controller. And since this device technically doesn't hack the game, the automated systems in place of issuing bans cannot make any kind of reasonable judgment or determination. And even if gameplay was being manually reviewed by a human being, in most cases, it's actually very difficult to determine if someone is a Cronus user unless they're using an obvious jitter mod and they're just sitting there rapid firing their sniper rifle. But mods like aim assist and anti-recoil are pretty much impossible to detect when they're tuned correctly. And the problem is that a lot of the videos on YouTube show off aim assist scripts that are pretty obvious because they're not actually tuned properly for the game they're playing or the settings that they're using within game. So lastly, because I know I'm going to get this question in the comments, and that is, what do I think about the Cronusmax and do I use mods myself? The short answer is no, and the reason aside from the whole ethical cheating argument are that regardless of what settings that you use with this thing, whether if it's tournament mode or whatever, there is still a noticeable amount of input delay on the PS4 that creates a lot of inconsistency for someone who is already a pretty good player and doesn't need something like this to try to do well in a video game. It actually works really well for controller crossplay on Xbox One and PS3 with surprisingly very little delay. But if you plan on buying this thing strictly just for the mods, thinking you're going to get like nuclears every single game, I think you're going to be a little bit disappointed, especially if you're already a pretty decent player. And reason being is that, in my opinion, the mods a lot of time feel like they're getting in the way more than they actually help. And I guess the best way to describe it is it feels like using training wheels when you already know how to ride a bicycle. Most of the time it just feels awkward and unnecessary, and it may help you go in a straight line better, but if you plan on power sliding and going over hills or doing wheelies, then you're probably just going to want to take them off. That's probably like the best analogy I could give for Cronusmax mods. Again, everybody's different, but this is just my opinion. But yeah, I hope that you guys enjoyed this video and found it educational and somewhat interesting. If you did, please leave a thumbs up rating on the video, comment below, and let me know what you think. Also, if you're new to the channel, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and ring the bell for post notifications. I will see you guys on the next video. Peace.